Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, I'll tell you why the Timberwolves win total at FanDuel, as of right now, is the perfect win total. It's actually fourth highest in the league. We'll talk about why the number is correct. It's all upcoming. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Happy Thursday, everybody. Today on the show, we're going to talk FanDuel win totals that came out this week. Obviously, very early, the offseason win totals, mid-offseason, post-free agency. The Timberwolves have the fourth highest mark in the league, and I want to talk about why I think that's about right and why the actual total that they put on the Wolves is right. We'll get into some other stuff here today as well. We'll talk a little bit about some ESPN power rankings at this stage in the offseason. A couple other news and notes. We'll kind of, in a sense, preview the Olympics. We'll do all that here on the show today. Big thank you off the top for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, you can watch wherever we can watch on YouTube. You can watch on Locked On Sports Minnesota. That's the app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And of course, you can listen wherever you get podcasts. All right. So FanDuel's NBA win totals are out. And it's not a surprise that the Timberwolves are one of the, call it top five teams in the league in terms of win total. We'll talk about power rankings later, which is obviously different, but they're going to look reasonably similar. So these win totals, I can't remember where the Wolves opened last year. I think they closed at the start of the season that I believe it was 44.5 was their win total. And I picked them last year to win right around 50 games. I think was kind of, if I'm not mixing up my years, was it 46.5? It was 46.5, I think, last year. And I picked them to win between 50 and 52 games. And then, of course, they ended up winning 56 games. They were in the battle for the number one seed in the West all season and only lost that by one game. They finished fourth in the league in record. Boston had 64 wins. OKC and Denver each had 57. The Wolves had 56, and nobody else in the entire NBA was within 5 games. The Clippers were the next best record in the league due to, obviously, every year there's injuries, but like Philly was on pace to have a great season before the Embiid injury, and Giannis getting hurt late in the year with Milwaukee and the Knicks injury issues. The Cavs, like everybody, right? And the Wolves were fairly fortunate, other than the Cat absence for about a month down the stretch. The Wolves were fairly fortunate injury-wise. And so that I'll get back to here in a second. So without further ado, the Timberwolves win total over at FanDuel is 52.5 is where the over-under is set. The only teams that are listed higher than the Timberwolves are Boston, who's number one in the league, 58.5, which is an insanely high win total. They're coming off a season where they won 64, but remember, the number is supposed to make you pause and say, are they more likely or less likely to go below or underneath this number? Well, yeah, you know what I mean. Are they more likely to be above or below this number? And it's really hard to say that any team is more likely than not to win 59 or more games, because that's what that's saying. For instance, the year before, so 22-23, nobody won more than 58.5 games. Milwaukee won 58. Boston themselves won 57. Nobody else had more than 53 wins in the league. 2 years ago, only one team had more. That was when Phoenix won 64. Memphis had 56. Nobody else was in that neighborhood. Go back. Well, actually, one more season is a weird one because it was the 2021 season. So that was shortened by 10 games. So that's actually not a good one to mention. But in recent history, there's been one team over the last 2 years, actually one team over the last 3 years that had 59 or more wins. It's not easy to do. Okay. So Boston's at 58.5. OKC's at 56.5 wins on the FanDuel win total. More on that in a second. The Knicks are at 53.5, which is just one game ahead of Minnesota. Of course, they've had a huge offseason. Minnesota's tied with Philadelphia. So the Sixers, also a busy offseason, also theoretically getting a healthy Joel Embiid back, also at 52.5 wins. Other Western Conference foes, Denver 51.5, Dallas 50.5, and then also Milwaukee at 50.5. Those are all the teams that have more than 50 wins on their over-under win total for the year, according to FanDuel as of late July. So the Wolves are 4th in the league, behind only Boston, OKC, and the Knicks. They're tied with the Sixers. 1 game ahead of Denver, 2 games ahead of Dallas. I think the Wolves' number is about right, and I'll tell you why. So notice the Western Conference teams all get dinged for being in the West. And we'll talk about OKC, which apparently is an exception here. But the Wolves, Denver, and Dallas, I don't think like in a vacuum anyone would say, oh yeah, over the course of the season, the Knicks are 2 games better than Denver and 3 games better than Dallas. And Boston's 8 games better than Dallas, who they just beat in the finals, albeit relatively easily. But still, that's a really dramatic thing to say. So the Wolves clearly are getting dinged for being in the West. That's partly why. Remember, Minnesota won 56 games last year. So at first glance, a lot of people's reactions to be, this is too low. The Wolves won 56 games. They didn't get clearly worse in the offseason other than losing Kyle Anderson. But I made the case when the Wolves signed Joe Ingles that the improvement to the offense with Joe Ingles on the floor instead of Kyle Anderson is enough to offset some of the defensive problems or concerns, I guess, by losing your defensive Swiss Army knife and Kyle Anderson. I don't want to get too in the weeds on that, but I think the easy way to say it is this team did not get obviously worse. There's nothing that's worse about this roster. Kyle Anderson and Joe Ingles is a pretty flat, there's no backup point guard, I guess, but nobody liked their backup point guards last year, and they were in a great spot at the trade deadline. So the roster's not worse. It just isn't. In fact, you could argue, I say there's no backup point guard. Obviously, they have Rob Dillingham, but no, I should say no proven backup point guard, no they didn't sign a veteran. They didn't bring back Monte Morris. Like from the outside looking in, people could be worried about that. But the upside of Dillingham, and given the fact we know the Wolves can cobble together a backup point guard in the form of Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Anthony Edwards, and likely Joe Ingles, that doesn't concern me a whole lot. So it's not like they lost a major rotation piece because they didn't. They kept 7 of their 8. And Joe Ingles isn't significantly worse than Kyle Anderson. He's just a different player. So why would they win 4 games less? Well, the West, I already mentioned, that's part of it. The other thing is relative health. Cat missed, about a month last year. Rudy, Mike Conley missed about the right number of games for guys of their age. But they didn't have anything else significant. And knock on wood, if that remains the case, 52.5 may be a little low, but you have to factor in that they could run into some worse luck this year. Look at some of the other, like Sacramento is a good example of a team that had great injury luck a couple of years ago, and then the following year struggled with that, and it was part of the reason they weren't as good. So we have to factor that in. And then we have to factor what I said just a minute ago in terms of Boston's crazy number is winning more than 52.5 games it's not exactly a walk in the park. Like, for instance, look at Denver. Denver, of course, got the 2 seed in the West this year, winning 57 games. They win one more game than the Wolves. But the year before, when they won the title, they only won 53 games, and they won the Western Conference. They were a 53-win team. Now, that's over 52.5, but barely. So I actually think the 52.5 number is about perfect. Do I think they're more likely to win more than 52.5 games? Yes. If I had to pick right now, I'd take the over. But the whole point about the line is it's supposed to make you pause. That's the idea most of the time. Most of the time with these lines. And you look at it and you go, yeah, I think they're likely. Like, I'm not going to put it, well, I sitting here right now, this is my official prediction, but I'm thinking they're in the 54, 55 win range again. And I should say, maybe not again. They won 56 last year. I just think that there's, I think that's about right. And it's certainly possible they win 60 games. Like, that's absolutely on the table. The thing we can't quantify is what's the leap look like for Anthony Edwards? What does this team look like with another full year, basically, of Cat on the floor with Rudy and Ant, and these guys figuring out another step? How good could Rob Dillingham be? There's tons of these questions that if you factor them into the equation, then it does feel a little low. But given the factor of the conference you're playing in, how good the other teams around you are and have only improved, and also that it's just really, really hard to win 56 games 2 years in a row, or to win even more than 53 or more games. And I mentioned Boston a little bit ago. Like, Boston's an example of a team that did do that. Boston won, what did I say they won? In 22-23, Boston won 57 games. And then this last year, they won 64 games. That's a pretty incredible thing. And they're not, 58.5 is way too high for a team like Boston. I mean, the post-championship hangover is a real thing, usually. And, there's also the Golden State approach where you go out and you win 72 games, but that's not 73 games, but that's not normal. And I don't know that Boston's at that level. And then you look at Minnesota, and I don't know. There's also the counter argument here is, are the Wolves going to be that much more hungry? They should be, because they went to the conference finals before getting bounced out. So does it make them want to dominate even more in the regular season? Or is there some sort of human nature, like, regression built in where they're like, we could kind of get there in our sleep again, which obviously isn't true in a tough Western Conference, but there's that factor. So there's so many things you have to weigh into it. They are so hard to quantify, but the whole exercise is literally quantifying how many wins you think they're going to get. And sitting here right now, I'd take the over, but I think the line's about perfect. I want to hit a couple others of the win totals here real quickly, and then we'll get to some other items here today, including some offseason power rankings and the Olympics. It's all coming here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at GameTime. GameTime is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball. It makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the GameTime app actually go down the closer you get to the first pitch. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, and views from your seat, plus their lowest price guarantee, GameTime takes guesswork out of buying NBA tickets. They have priority last-minute deals as well, so all you have to do is save 60% off. That's all you have to do. 60% off buying last minute tickets. That's not a hard thing to do, right? To be asked to save 60%. You buy last minute tickets for anything that includes sports like MLB, also concerts, comedy, theater, whatever you're doing this summer. Summer's still got a few weeks left in it. And there's plenty of time to travel and enjoy with GameTime. You can also get views from your seat on GameTime, get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. You can also take advantage of the lowest price guarantee. If you find a price somewhere else that's competitive or better, GameTime will credit you 110% of the difference. Also, your purchase is covered with GameTime ticket coverage, the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. Take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA. That's LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download GameTime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Do you watch Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day long? If so, no doubt you have to turn down the volume because of all the shouting. Instead, make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right. So some other over-unders that stuck out to me. So we talked about the Boston one a little bit already. The OKC one to me is far too high. And I loved OKC's offseason for OKC. I didn't like it as a Timberwolves follower. But OKC had a strong offseason. It's hard to argue with that. I thought the Alex Caruso trade was huge. And he fits them better than Josh Giddey, given, everybody else that needed the ball in their hands there. Obviously getting Isaiah Hartenstein is a big signing as well. He got a ton of money, but that signing makes sense for them. Bringing back rotation guys, Isaiah Joe, Aaron Wiggins, they fit what they're trying to do. Like right now, I 100% understand why they have the highest win total in the West. I think 56.5 is a little bit I guess they were the number one seed last year. They won 57 games. I think I'd probably, but I don't. Putting their win total basically in line with where they finished last season and having the Wolves four games lower, is Alex Caruso and Hartenstein really worth, 4 wins or whatever? I don't know. I would have put their line maybe right around the same place as the Wolves. I don't know that they got significantly better. Maybe a game higher, because you could argue OKC improved more than the Wolves this offseason. I think that's a completely fair argument. But it just felt a little high. So if the Wolves are going to be at 52.5, I'd put OKC at like 53.5. So I'd take the under on 56.5 for OKC. To be clear, I think they're probably the best team in the West roster-wise. I mean, considering SGA being a top 8 player in the entire league, And right now, in just a ranking of best players, you'd have to put him ahead of Anthony Edwards. I think you have to, because he's a little more well-rounded, has done it all a little bit more longer. And he's not nearly as aesthetically pleasing to watch, but that's a little bit of a different question. And certainly Ant could have surpassed him as early as this year. Like, I mean, the ceiling is much higher for Anthony Edwards. I don't think there's any question about that either. I'm just calling it like you see it on the floor. It's hard to argue against SGA. Now, I have got some questions about Hartenstein and Chet Holmgren playing together. I think in theory it works, on paper it works, but how will it work in practice? I'm very curious to see how that works. But getting rid of a guy that you didn't need to guard in Josh Giddey, basically, it's oversimplifying it, but I think that's true. You saw how the Wolves tried to or took care of OKC and Giddey. I think that's going to help them a ton. So a little bit crazy, but I get it. Let's see. We talked about the Knicks numbers a little high, 53.5. Obviously, they're busy offseason as well. The Bridges thing, I mean, giving up 1 billion picks, which, saying that after the Wolves gave up what they gave up for Gobert, but still like 1 billion picks. The Brunson contract's a huge win for them. Of course, the Anunoby extension had to get done, and it's rich, but you got to do what you got to do. I think that they're, certainly much improved from a good team last year, but 53.5 still feels a little high. And that's, again, being in the East. Boston's the only other team that's in the same neighborhood. I mean, Boston at 58.5, the Knicks at 53.5, and then Milwaukee at 50.5. And I like the Milwaukee number. I would take the Knicks number is actually probably about right. I don't know that I'd feel confident taking the under on the Knicks at 53.5, but I wouldn't really feel confident about taking the over. Milwaukee, I'd feel very comfortable going over on 50.5. I think Milwaukee, like they've got guys like Dame is if he wants it, he's got to go get it this year. Giannis is healthy enough to be in the Olympics. I would be taking the over on Milwaukee at 50.5. That to me is the other one that kind of stood out to me, at least in the upper echelon of the win totals. There's some other interesting ones out there. We'll spend more time on it when we get close to the season. San Antonio at 36.5. Like, that feels close. I think this is a matter of, are they still in tank mode at any point this season? Because if they are, that's way too high. But if they're not, I think they're going to make a run at high 30s wins. I mean, I think Wembanyama could be that good this year, although I think there's a lot of assumptions being made. I get how good he looked at the end of last season, but there's, of course, what's the impact that Chris Paul's going to have on that team, right? The other one that stuck out to me as, and I don't want to get into this one as much, but I just want to throw it out there, something we'll come back to. Memphis at 47.5, which is the same as Sacramento's at 46.5. But getting John Morant back and having relative health, that number is just like, hey, we don't know. Like, if these guys are healthy, they're going to win more than 47 games, very likely 48 games. But if they're not, they're going to be miserable again. So that's just kind of a shot in the dark, in my opinion. But I thought that was an interesting number. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about offseason. Well, actually, this is related. So ESPN has offseason power rankings that came out just following free agency. So about a week ago, just got around to kind of digging into them a little bit. And there's not a whole lot to be gleaned from this, but I just want to throw it out there. Boston, of course, number one. No major changes to their roster. I like them getting Baylor Shireman at the end of the first round. Remember, he was my favorite pick for Minnesota had they stayed at, I'm blanking at where they were, 23 or no, 26, I guess it would have been. And he ended up going to Boston with the last pick of the first round, I think it was. That was a really nice addition. He's obviously not going to be a rotation guy, but anyway, Boston's number one. That makes sense. OKC number two. That makes sense to me. I'm fine with it. It's funny because Dallas is the team that went to the finals, but OKC was tied for won the top seed in the West and probably improved their team the most this offseason. So I get that. Minnesota's number three on the list. And I'll just read the blurb that Dave McMenamin has here on ESPN. He says, coming off the franchise's most successful season in 20 years, there's a lot to like about the Wolves summer so far. They inked coach Chris Finch to a contract extension, drafted guards Rob Dillingham and Terrence Shannon Jr., and saw Anthony Edwards and Nickeil Alexander-Walker commit to play for the U.S. and Canada, respectively, in the Olympics, which should only sharpen their games. All right, me talking now. I don't know that Anthony Alexander-Walker playing internationally really adds much to the summer other than entertainment for us. And hopefully those guys grow a little bit. I wouldn't put that under biggest moments of the offseason necessarily from a Wolves standpoint. But They certainly improved their roster more than anybody thought they could. And I talked about how there wasn't a whole lot of change that would necessarily make me think they're going to be worse than last year. But to move up, to trade up for Rob Dillingham's a massive move. And it doesn't make them worse. Like, Rob Dillingham's not going to be worse than what they got out of Jordan McLaughlin and Monte Morris last year. And if he is, they could pivot like they did at times last year anyway. When McLaughlin was hurt, when he wasn't playing well, before they had Monte Morris, when Mike Conley was hurt, like, they could find a way to make this thing work. And getting Joe Ingles, like, if they weren't able to get Joe Ingles, if they had signed somebody else for a vet minimum deal in place of Kyle Anderson, I may not have been so optimistic. But as I've said before, I think the offense for Joe Ingles is relatively equal to what Kyle Anderson gave you defensively. Like, the improvement on offense should be as great as any sort of regression on defense with no Kyle Anderson. The Knicks are number 4. I'm okay with that. Dallas is number 5. I'm okay with that too. They've got the Sixers at 6, which of course that's all going to hinge on health. And of course, well, yeah, health for both Joel Embiid and Paul George. Denver at 7. Actually, I'd probably put Denver ahead of Philadelphia and maybe even Dallas. I get that they lost KCP. I get that they just keep losing kind of these veteran, also Reggie Jackson, these veteran rotation pieces. But I don't know. I just, it's still Denver. It's still Jokic. And to have them at 7 feels a little bit low. They did just sign Russell Westbrook, whatever that does to your opinion about them. Of course, Deron Holmes, their first round pick, is out for the year. He tore his Achilles in the summer league, which is horrible. Milwaukee at 8, the Pacers at 9, Cleveland at 10. I don't mind these rankings. Magic at 11 and the Suns at 12, of course, with the new coach. That feels about right to me. Like, I'd put Denver a spot or 2 higher, but other than that, that's about right. So Minnesota at number 3 in the power rankings, which is still kind of surreal, frankly. All right, I want to talk briefly Olympics and one other quick note too. We'll get to all that here next. All right, so real quick, a note that I meant to mention when I was talking power rankings. One other thing to keep an eye on that was listed in one of these offseason. Oh, that's what it was. It was Bobby Marks has a an offseason like impactful moves tracker thing, where he listed like impact transactions and guys that are resigning and stuff like that. In one of his notes, he's under what to watch for. He says, besides the resolution to the ongoing ownership dispute, this is over at ESPN, by the way, keep an eye on extension talks with Rudy Gobert. The 3-time All-Star center has 2 years left on his contract, can become a free agent next offseason if he declines his player option. It's unlikely Minnesota would extend him to a 4-year, $243 million extension. Gobert could decline the $46.6 million player option and then extend for lower salary, but with more years attached. That I don't really have any commentary on that other than we just haven't really talked about it much this offseason, mostly because it doesn't have impact on this year and everybody kind of figures it's going to get done. I mean, the Wolves gave up so much for Gobert. They're not going to let him walk after 3 seasons in Minnesota. But they're also not going to give him a max deal, as Bobby Marks points out. So curious to see what that looks like. This is going to be probably his last big contract now that he's on the wrong side of 30. So could the Wolves agree to, tear up that last year, give him a, 5-year deal at, I don't know, I'm just throwing this out there, like $30 million a year instead of like the $60 million he'd get if he signed the max. 30 is a lot less, but like, could there be somewhere in the middle where they say, yeah, we'll keep you until you're 36 or 37, which is a long time for a big. But that's probably the way to go now, given the second apron and the penalties and the restrictions they're already suffering based on their salary cap situation. So that's something to keep an eye on. We haven't talked about it a ton on the show because there isn't much else to say other than what I just did. It's probably going to happen. And it's going to be weird if we get too far into the season and it hasn't happened. And then there's obviously restrictions on when you can extend guys, but something will get done at some point, but it's something to keep in mind. All right, Olympics. So the Olympic groups, we talked briefly about this the other day, so I'm not going to go too deep into that right now. But the overall Wolves players on different teams, we've also kind of briefly talked about that. But okay, well, actually, let's start here. So Team USA has 3 Group C games. They play Serbia on Sunday. Then on, Wednesday, they play South Sudan. And then 3 days after that, they play Puerto Rico. Those are your pool play games. It's not the strongest group out there. It's probably the next best group. Now, Serbia won the silver medal in the World Cup last year, and they do have Jokic, or they're expected to have Jokic. But they're not in Group A. I mean, Group A has Australia, who won the bronze medalist last time around. They've also got Canada, and then Spain, who's ranked second in the world. So the Team USA is probably in the second best group, and I mean, like they avoided the worst one, and they're obviously they're favored at all these games. It's not easy though. Like Serbia is going to be really tough. South Sudan, as we've seen, is solid, and Puerto Rico is maybe the weakest team of those 3. I don't know where they're actually ranked in the world, but I think that they are. And then of course you go into the actual tournament play once you get through the pool. So quarterfinals, semis, the gold medal game is August 10th, which is what 2 weeks from the Saturday. So anyway, first game is this Sunday against Serbia. That's going to be a lot of fun and probably the toughest game of the first round. Not probably, it will be the toughest game of pool play. So that's upcoming. But in terms of Wolves players that are playing in Canada, oh, here we go. I've got my world rankings right here. Yeah, Puerto Rico is not ranked. Because they won their tournament in the qualifying tournament. So that's why they're in the Olympics. So the toughest group is A. It's Australia, who's 5 in the world, then Greece, Spain, who is, I believe, second in the world, and then Greece. That's a really tough group. And then Group B is Germany, France, Japan, Latvia. Yeah, so C is the second toughest group, but it's not nearly as tough as Australia, Canada, Spain. I mean, if the team, I keep almost saying Wolves, if the Team USA was in that group with Australia, Spain, and Canada, that would be insane. But as it is, U.S. is number 1 in the world. Serbia is 4. South Sudan is 33, but a feisty team, a solid team, and then also Puerto Rico. So anyway, in terms of Wolves players that are playing in the Olympics, of course, Anthony Edwards playing for Team USA, coming off the bench, but really kind of functioning as their 6th man. It'd be really interesting to see how this plays out when the games count starting on Sunday. And then Rudy Gobert, of course, playing for France, along with Wembanyama. They're going to be a ton of fun to watch. Like really interested to see what that looks like when Team USA has to deal with France potentially at some point. Or likely will have to at some point. And then also Nickeil Alexander-Walker with Canada, who won the World Cup last year. And basically that roster is what, like, I think everybody but 2 is an NBA player on Canada's roster. And the Joe Ingles with Australia, who's always good. So 4 Timberwolves players playing on national teams in the Olympics, which will be fun. Like there will always be somebody playing that has Wolves ties. Ant with USA, Gobert with France, Nickeil Alexander-Walker with Canada, and Joe Ingles with Australia. So lots to look forward to there. The Serbia game against Jokic on Sunday should be tons of fun. And there's certainly going to be some sort of Ant signature moment at some point in pool play, I would say, where all of a sudden he takes over a game. But watching that dynamic and the push and pull on younger players versus the older generation, older guard for Team USA is going to be really, really intriguing. So we'll talk a lot more about that. That'll probably be most of what we do on Monday's show is talk about the Sunday game against Serbia. So lots to look forward to there. All right. That's all we have for you today here on the show. Of course, we're back tomorrow. We're still daily Monday through Friday here as we get through the month of July. So make sure you tune back in. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.